Hey everybody, welcome to the Thoughtful Bro live streaming as always on a mighty blaze. We are so happy to have you here for another wonderful Tuesday talking about books, especially hot, buzzy, super trendy, on point books like this one. Gold Diggers by Sanjena Sathian. We'll talk to her in just a moment, but a few words before we get started. As you know, we're here every Tuesday to talk about what makes great books tick, what makes great authors tick. Mighty Blaze is an all-volunteer initiative that began at the beginning of COVID to help writers reach readers when real-life book tours had been canceled. We are now expanding, obviously, beyond COVID into the new virtual world we're all trying to figure out. You can find scores of our interviews on the Mighty Blaze Facebook page and YouTube pages. Recent interviews include Anne Lamott, Jonathan Lethem, John Irving, Edwidge Dandikat, Erica Jong, George Saunders, and so many more. We do about 6 to 8 new interviews every single week. At A Mighty Blaze, we're not asking for any money. You can support us by liking us or following us on our socials on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. So just give us a like if you're here. If you're new, you can follow us or subscribe to our weekly podcast. You can also find a schedule of all our weekly interviews on our website. You can subscribe at amightyblaze.com to our newsletter. You'll get it every Sunday and just hear about the fresh stuff that's coming up that week. If you are in the mood to spend money, as usual, just open up a new tab in your browser right now and purchase this excellent book. It's one of those deals where you can be like, I saw like whoever, Dave Matthews in like 1992 or something. This is like one of those books where you're going to be like, I read that right when it came out. I knew all about it. And another thing, we're going to put a link to Sanjena's favorite indie bookstore in Atlanta. It's called Acapella Books, I think. And we're going to put a link to that in the chat. You can get actually a signed copy of this book by clicking on that link. So our producer will pop that in just a second. If you have audience questions, please just put them in the chat and they'll make their way to me at the end of the interview. And I think that's all I have. So to do a little bit of an intro, Sanjena Sathian was raised in Georgia by parents who came from India. She's a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop and an alumna of the Clarion Writers Workshop. She's also worked as a journalist in San Francisco and Mumbai. Her award-winning short fiction appears or is forthcoming in, get ready, Conjunctions, Boulevard, Joyland, Salt Hill, and the Masters Review, and her nonfiction has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Washington Post, The San Francisco Chronicle, Food and Wine, The Boston Globe, The Juggernaut, The Millions, and more. Her debut novel, which just came out, is getting all the buzz. It recently was optioned by Mindy Kaling's production company and will soon become a Hulu TV series. We'll talk about that in a moment. Ron Charles of The Washington Post called the book a witty social satire with a dash of magic, a work of 24-karat genius. And Ron Charles went on to say, looking up, this is like one of my favorite all-time, you know what I'm about to say, don't you? This is like one of my favorite all-time ends to a review. Looking up from the pages of this sparkling debut, I experienced something like the thrill of the luckiest 49ers who must have felt gold, gold, gold. Sanjena, welcome to the Thoughtful Bro.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, you gotta love Ron Charles. Okay, so there's so much to talk about. There's like so much happening for this book. It's been an amazing publishing journey for you. This book happens to be quite particularly my cup of tea. I love magical realism, things with a fantasy element to them. You have a very flexible, powerful, emotional metaphor at the center of this work, which we're going to talk about. But I guess the real question that I have to ask you is, has Kanye West read this book yet?
Who knows what state of mind Kanye West is in at any point. Well, I heard
it. Well, he should read this book just to keep him busy and like up to something productive. Anyway, but no, my real first question is, why don't you just, for those who haven't read this book yet, just tell us a little bit about what this book's about.
Totally, yeah. So the novel follows an Indian American sort of slacker turned stoner named Neil Narayan. Picks up when he is 15 years old, and he is kind of struggling with his community's expectations for high achievement. But meanwhile, his best friend, childhood crush, and the girl next door, Anita, is totally living up to the promise of this community. She is the golden child, so to speak. And he figures out there's a reason that she's doing so well. In addition to her sort of natural smarts and talent, she and her mother have been stealing gold from other members in their community, other Indians in the community, and they transmute that gold into kind of a magical elixir, drink it, and this allows them to steal the ambitions of other people in their community. And beneath all of that kind of zany, capery plot is really like a love story, a family story. And the novel picks up again 10 years later in 2016 Silicon Valley, with cutaways to, as you know, 1980s Bombay and 1849 Gold Rush, California.
Yep. It's so great. It's so great. I just want to cut right to what I love most about the book, and that is the metaphor at the center of the book. This, the characters in the book, they steal gold and they melt it, as you say, into a lemonade, I think is how it's referred to in the book. And they drink this lemonade and then they are able to kind of co-opt the ambitions of other people. I love just a good, flexible conceit at the center of a book. And there's just sort of so many ways to interpret this. And just to name a few, certainly it's kind of symbolic. And I thought it was a new take that I hadn't quite heard before of this kind of cannibalistic atmosphere of the Indian American life and culture, just that like there's only so many spots and we all have to compete with each other for it. That only so many people can get into Harvard and we've got to kind of go head to head on that. And then also just, I love the idea of like America being viewed as a place for gold diggers, period. I mean, back in the 1800s, it was real gold digging. Now it's Silicon Valley or an admission to Harvard, what have you. But anyway, I want to open the floor to a more open question about how that metaphor came to you and how you see it as kind of ritually symbolic.
Yeah, I love the word flexible because I think that's what you have to be when you're writing, and when you're writing something that's long and novel-sized. I started with just sort of like a plot idea, a conceit. I was just like interested in gold thefts that had happened around Atlanta when I was growing up, and I was like, I wonder who did those. And my mom, who kind of loves a good like mafia yarn, would always say, "I swear to you, like the people stealing this gold, they're Indians, because they know exactly where to go in the house to find that gold." And so I'd just been sort of like interested in that possibility. And so from conceit, I worked backward into character. And then once I had the characters, I could then explore this world. So I didn't start with sort of a metaphor for understanding the model minority. I started with magical object. Let's follow that, which is, again, one of the fun things about writing magical realism is you take a conceit. And when I teach, I talk about a kind of snowballing effect. So you like roll it down the hill, you just follow it. Gravity kind of takes control. And from there, it accretes meaning. And you don't have to force it on there, because by altering reality just the slightest bit, that conceit will show you where else it can go, at the risk of sounding a little mystical. And so one of the things that was really cool about writing this book was having that idea, starting to do more research into sort of the properties and the cultural significance of gold across history and across cultures, and realizing like what I had was cool, but there was more to do with it. And so just following each of those little branches.
Yeah, and one of the things that I love most about the way you talk about this, because I've heard some other interviews where you talk about this, you talk about the importance of having an emotional truth behind a metaphor like this. And I find that this is just such an interesting measuring stick for like the quality of metaphor in fantastical writing, in that, let's just take Star Wars, for example. When you started out, I think the Force and Yoda and Jabba the Hutt, they bore a certain kind of emotional freight for that story. And then as you go on, you get into this zone where, Jar Jar Binks and all these things, and it's like they're just inventing for the sake of invention, but there isn't an emotional truth behind the metaphor. And that's sort of like exactly the moment where the series sort of begins to fall apart kind of in the eyes of fans. And I think like this metaphor that you have is just very emotionally resonant and does a lot of work for you. And I just wanted to have you talk a little bit, because you're so eloquent talking about that, this importance of emotional truth behind metaphor.
Yeah, I mean, this is a kind of another thing that I love talking about when I teach young writers who are messing with speculative fiction, because often, like, if I'm teaching as one of like 3 or 4 writers, I get sent the weirdos because they're like, oh, you do magic, so like we'll send you all of these kids. And the kids who come to me, and I am thinking about like a summer camp that I taught, so I'm not being diminutive. Like I have taught teenagers, but you know, whether they're teens or adults or anyone who kind of comes in from that tradition, often there are people who grew up reading space opera or grew up reading like secondary world high fantasy, which is not really what I come from. I come from like literary and magical realism. But I often find that like I just admire their capacity for invention. These kids are so good at world building. They're so good at just leaving the reality that the rest of us feel stuck in. And so I can say, like, I don't have to teach you that. If you're already doing that, that's incredible. What I can do is hand you the work of writers who put that invention in conversation with sort of an urgent emotional question. And so I do think there is like value in literature that it does sort of invent for its own purposes, but the kind that I do in the sort of corner of literary fiction that I occupy, it's always in conversation with something that feels really urgent. And sometimes that's a social issue. Like, I mean, the Metamorphosis is like, I don't consider that a particularly like emotional story. I feel like Gregor Samsa's plight is sort of, it's there in writing, but it's not something that like deeply resonates with me emotionally. But there's something eerie about the world that Kafka is responding to, and so there's an urgency there. So emotional truth is one way of putting it, but I think like just a need to understand something that is in the real world, like that's what speculative fiction does best. And Ursula Le Guin talks about how this is, you know, all science fiction is it's not really about the future, it's actually about the present. And I think there's a version of that that's true for speculative fiction as well.
Right. I mean, another great example, I mean, you brought up social issues, and that made me think of the movie Get Out, which is, you know, one of my favorite movies. And right, there's an issue where it's like he's talking about some of the, you know, predatory aspects of racism, and how can you represent that in a way that I think, frankly, just shocks people into understanding. I mean, there's only so many ways to come at something from a realistic standpoint where until people feel like either A, I'm bored, or B, I've heard this before. And I think speculative fiction just offers a new entry point into material.
Yeah. Parasite too, right? Like
Totally.
It's genre to just genius effect.
Yep. So Salman Rushdie is out with a new book of essays, which I haven't read yet, but I read an editorial he recently published in the New York Times. I think it's called it's still like one of the most read articles of the recent few weeks. I think the title of the article is something like, "Tell us about the story you really love," or something. And the point he's making is that he's really going hard after the greatest stories that have ever been told, the ones that are most memorable, is the ones that are most lovable, are stories that have this magical realist element, a fable, a folktale, fairy tale, myth, and so on. You said once in an interview, you said when you were in your 20s, whenever that was, but or like you were like in your mid 20s, and you said you were writing and you felt locked out of your own fiction. You were writing only realist fiction. And I'm just curious, A, why did you feel locked out of this realistic mode? And B, what is it about speculative fiction that frees you up or that allows you to access things that are otherwise inaccessible?
Yeah, I was locked out, I think, because I was trying to do something that is just not natively me. And I've tried to do that a bunch of times. So it's not like a thing that you figure out once and then get away from. But like you know, George, you've read and spoken to George Saunders. So this is someone I think about a lot when I sort of think about this kind of art that a lot of writers take. Like, he started out writing sort of like knockoff Hemingway, and it wasn't very good by his assessment. And then he became playful and found one of what I think is one of the most memorable voices in American fiction, period. And I think like a lot of writers have to go through that, where like the people they grew up reading or thinking they should write like, and sometimes the people they grew up loving, imitating them is not going to work. It's not going to cut it. And I grew up thinking that the immigrant novel looked a certain way, that it was sort of somber, realist, that it had to be sort of self-serious. And so my work was starting to look really self-serious. And I'd had moments where I wasn't that way. Like my senior year of college, the first time I read George Saunders, actually, my fiction changed massively. Like I just started writing with verve and voice and humor. And something similar had to happen sort of in my mid-20s, where I was like, something's not working. This is really like up its own ass, and I've got to get out of there. So I just changed my reading habits, basically. I don't entirely know how I found my way to these other writers, but I think some of them were people I'd read a little bit before and then sort of devoted myself wholeheartedly to. So some were realists. I had like read some Lori Moore, but I went back and read everything Lori Moore. I think I've read almost everything she's ever written in fiction. Who else? Miranda July, who's sort of realist, but there's always magical thinking at play. I discovered Kelly Link at that point, who I think has a very sort of George Saunders-y feel to her. And so then I could put these writers, Amy Bender, like I put these writers in conversation with novelists who I'd always loved, like Zadie Smith, and like Fitzgerald and Franzen and all these people. And so by finally sort of like having like really like a remix kind of has to happen in your brain to be like, oh, this is the full array of my influences. And then something new could happen. But I think that's a big part of it. It's like people don't change their reading diets very often. They think they know what they like, so they read what they like. And they're not willing to be changed, be surprised, or be transformed by new kinds of fiction.
Well, that's really interesting that you made this change, which ultimately was so artistically and ultimately commercially successful for you, this tweak to your writing, but it came from changing your reading diet rather than kind of first experimenting in your writing. I really like that idea. And I'm just wondering, could you zero in a little bit more on this idea? I think I heard you say that it came to you pretty fully formed, this idea for the conceit for your novel, but just fill us in a little bit on sort of the magic of finding out what this novel would be.
Yeah. So I draft a lot and throw a lot away. A professor in college called that vomit drafting, or mudslinging. That's really how I am. So the conceit was fully formed, but I would never presume to say the book was. It was a disastrously messy process. But I think the question was discovering what was there.
Yeah, I'm just, I think people, to me, this is a real world-class idea. Certainly it's, captured the imagination of a lot of people so far, captured the imagination of Mindy Kaling. It's a big, important, successful, cool-ass idea. And I'm just wondering, like, how did you find this cool-ass idea?
Yeah, I mean, like I was saying, I started with that little caper idea. I first wrote from Anita's perspective, because this is, a young woman who's basically my age, so it made sense to write from her perspective. And that was self-serious. She's like kind of interesting from the outside, but she was not interesting for like a narrator. Partly because she's not an introspective person unless she has to be forced into introspection. And so I was writing from her perspective. I wrote from her mom's perspective because I knew that those two characters were going to be the gold thieves. And it was instinctual to write from a woman's point of view. But then I really got stuck because it was some of the old problems of like self-seriousness, like wistful longing, immigrant story. And I ended up head hopping into Neil, the current narrator's point of view. And it felt like all of a sudden, like I had access to what this voice was going to be. And I realized once I was writing from his point of view, I was like, this is this is fundamentally me, and it's also a little bit not me. Like, it gives me just the ability to, like, when I need to write away from myself in order to make plot happen, I can make him be like a silly 15-year-old teenage boy. But fundamentally, like, his emotional orientation toward the world was mine, and I could funnel myself through that. And so then once I had Neil's voice, I could begin exploring the world around him. And I wrote a few different versions of the chunks in Atlanta, and realized that I was kind of going to be drawing on my childhood, drawing on my teenage years a lot. And then I kind of knew that there were going to be time jumps. So from there, I had to figure out what these time jumps were going to be. But it's always like I can see just maybe like 20 feet in front of me. I can't see miles and miles in front of me.
Right. Cool. So let's talk about Neil for a second. He's the narrator and the main character. And you describe him or his type in the book. This is a term I had never heard before, an ABCD. So first, can you tell us in the audience what an ABCD is, just in case people might not know?
Yeah, this is a term that has been slapped on a lot of Indian Americans of my generation, actually South Asians in general, and most of us resent it. It stands for American Born Confused Desi, and the term Desi is the word used for basically people from the subcontinent.
Got it. Okay. So that was interesting. And what more interesting, obviously, is like what's beneath that. And I think what was like really enlightening for me in this is just the enormous pressure cooker atmosphere of this family situation that he's in and this culture that he's in. I mean, it's just something that really struck me as fresh in the book and raw. And maybe that means I'm underread. But I just thought it's also due to you. It's just kind of very kind of acutely portraying this. I mean, so some of the impressions that I got were the way that everybody is just sort of a walking resume. And it's like, it felt like when you read about military situations, when like a general walks into a room or somebody walks into a room and they've got a bunch of medals on their chest and like everybody knows just what the pecking order is, like, and that's how it felt. It's like, oh, well, he went to Harvard and he works in Silicon Valley and he's married and he has this kind of house in this kind of neighborhood, and like that's his story. Like, what have you done for me lately? And it created this pressure cooker atmosphere, which, you know, made the lemonade where you can steal people's ambitions for success so much more powerful. There's a great line in there. You know, I think this is Neil talking. There was no room to imagine multiple sorts of futures. We'd put all our brain power towards conjuring up a single one, Harvard. That is a rough life. I mean, it's like not rough in like a coal miner's life, but it's like psychologically really rough.
Yeah. And I mean, that's even beginning to articulate why that is a hard way to grow up. That was fraught for me because I think like it was both taxing and also like you have to be able to see the humor in it. You have to be able to step away and say like, okay, those were high stakes for us at the time, but like now can we see how that's not how actually life is? Like there are many ways to be a human in the world. And a lot of that too has to do with, I think, like my particular corner of Indian America being unable to think about privilege and basically only thinking of themselves as outsiders to a meritocratic system that they were then going to climb up. Like I think that's like an inaccurate picture of reality, but it's the picture that we grew up with. So I think that's partly what I had to do, is sort of come to terms with these high stakes, this balance between like writing high stakes feelings, but actually kind of having semi low stakes in the real world. Can I re-inhabit the head of someone who believes that his entire life depends on where he gets into college, what kind of job he gets? And that's not entirely how I see the world anymore, but I did have to return to that world. The other thing that has been interesting though about seeing the book in the world has been like I thought of this as a fairly like Indian American specific experience, that I was like my corner of Indian America, certainly not everyone's. But I've been hearing from a lot of people who say like, you know, that speaks to the way I grew up too. And some of those people are from immigrant families. Some of them are just from families who like were kind of trying to do the upwardly mobile thing. Some of them, I think some of it is like a millennial problem where like we were forced into kind of insane pre-professionalism. For some people, it's like, this was just what it was like to try and get a job in the tech world. So, and one of my friends who is not Indian said at one point, he was like, well, it's because you're not really writing about just immigration, you're writing about capitalism, which you could probably say for anyone. But I thought that was interesting too, because that pre-professionalism, that LinkedIn life is like the life of so many people, whether or not they come from an immigrant background.
Well, I hate to say it, but it's also, it hit a little close to home because it's a lot about what it's like being friends with a bunch of writers and being in a group of creatives, you know? I mean, it's this way that like, yes, we are all in this together in a way, but we're also all individual performers who are trying to, there's a feeling which I personally think is a false feeling, but an inescapable feeling of there's only so much oxygen here to breathe. And sort of when it comes down to it, anybody will do anything to just get a leg up. And so I just want to say your book resonated with me on that level.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Okay, so just one other topic I want to talk about with the Indian American experience and the immigrant experience here is the way that the characters in your book are searching for a meaning of home. And it reminded me of, I once saw Charles Yu speak. Now, Charles won the National Book Award for Interior Chinatown. And he made this comment in a reading, and I think he's born and raised in Los Angeles. And he made the remark that I got the feeling that I wasn't from America, but I also wasn't from anywhere else. And so I thought your book just tread this ground so well and so acutely about kind of, well, are you an American or are you not? And will you ever have that sense of home? And one of the best passages in the book, if you're up for a reading, it was on page 200. And this is just to set people up a little bit for this. This is an amazing passage. And Neil, the main character, is doing research on immigration to this country by other Indians. And he comes across a character who came to this country during the gold rush. And this is sort of about the end of his life.
The Bombayan is aging. Soon he will die, as will his secret. When he boarded that East India Company ship some 30 years earlier, he had hoped to cheat history, to eschew his fate as a colonized man. Now, on the other side of the planet, as he rubs his eyes in the dim newspaper office and steps into the lowering yellow light of a Marysville evening, he sees that he did not manage to cheat history, which is inescapable. No, he raced right into it with all the force of someone swimming upstream. History let him live in its hot, complex swirl for a few decades, and soon it will close in on him as it takes us all. He shuts the newspaper door and walks to town where, against all odds and at all costs, he has made himself a home.
I love that. The passage is so great, and it really struck me so much. It comes towards the end of the book, or maybe about 2/3 of the way through the book. And you'd been kind of probing around these questions of what home means. And that one just really struck me as a lyrical evocation of that. Just to put a question to all this, when does an immigrant from India feel that they are truly American? What does that take to make this feel like home?
I mean, I think it's a tricky question for particularly Indian immigrants who came to the US the way my parents did, which is basically as so-called skilled workers. And not to nerd out too much on immigration, but this is like an important thing that I found myself talking about a lot on book tour, because I don't think people know this about the Indian diaspora, is many members of the Indian diaspora came here because they were already highly educated. and because they could fill roles as doctors, businessmen, and business people and engineers. And so that's where that stereotype comes from, that like we're all doctors and engineers. It's because we were selected that way. And so one thing that's been interesting about watching people my parents' age kind of come to terms with America has been seeing that they began as outsiders, but they had this insulation that other immigrants do not necessarily have, because they had, if not money immediately, they were going to have money. Like they were doctors. They were like on a path to make money pretty quickly. And they just had the insulation that sort of skilled or white collar work provides. So there's a kind of social insulation. And this is the drama of being the so-called model minority, is you are given the class and social trappings of the elite, but you are still a foreigner. And so what do you do? How do you navigate that question? Can you understand the ways in which your experience is basically more privileged than many other immigrants? But how do you deal with the fact that despite that, you are often treated as sort of perpetual foreigner? And so I often feel like it's kind of a fragile and like unstable sense of home. Like I can get through most days without feeling like I'm that different in a large urban city where like there are a lot of different kinds of humans in a city like Atlanta. And I feel like I belong. I've got money, power, privilege. I'm okay. But like last week, I went on vacation and I drove through certain parts of Georgia, and I was just like, I do not feel American in these chunks of this. Like there was a giant Confederate flag on just off the highway with the words "join up," and it didn't say what you were supposed to join. But I was like, they don't want me in their club.
Wow.
It's tiny. And Georgia is an interesting place to think about and write about because of that, because you have these like, you have Atlanta, which is this like Black city, this immigrant city, and this old white person city. And then you also have these like the rest of the state. And so that I think is actually kind of a perfect like geographical way to think about the way a lot of Indians have to negotiate our Americanness. It's like there are some places where we maybe don't have to think about it. San Francisco is one of those places. Other times you really can't escape it.
Yeah, these are fascinating questions. And I mean, on a personal note, my wife is from Ghana. I have 4 young children who are mixed race and have a hyphenated last name that does not sound American at all. I mean, my family is from the Midwest. They've been here for hundreds of years. And now I have these children who do not look and whose names do not sound apple pie at all. And so I'm just saying, I think this is an issue that I'm trying to work through. And like, I find books like this so fascinating for that reason. And I think, frankly, as in the world we live in today, where it's so easy to get from one country to another, these are questions so many Americans are working through. I think they're just such important questions about, frankly, what does it really mean to be an American, and who like really is American, whatever that means. These are profound questions to explore.
Yeah, there's a great line from Open City by Teju Cole that I'll probably slightly butcher, but it's something like, "It is a great thing to be a writer in exile, but what is exile now when everyone comes and goes freely?" Really interesting phrasing.
Love that. I love that. We got to pop that in the chat. That is a great quote. Okay. Now, we got some questions from the audience that are coming up, but I, of course, would be remiss if I didn't talk about your amazing publishing ride, which you've already talked about, but I'm going to ask that you talk to me about it again. But you had an amazing ride. The book sold at auction. There was a ton of excitement even when the book sold. Then you had Mindy Kaling's production company come along and auction it for TV, and I think that is sort of happening now. You're in the process of getting that show together, and I'm sure you can talk about that. But I guess before you get to that, can you just talk about, did you expect this for this book? Did you feel like, oh man, this thing's going to be a home run, or what?
I don't know if it's a home run, but you hope, right? This is the thing that I think everyone who makes stuff can relate to, is like in the private recesses of your mind, you dare to hope. And you have to have the sort of like you have to have the greediness and ambition to like dare to set down words every day and be like, I deserve to do this. And I got to write it in an MFA program, which was a huge boon because I think it does mean someone else has told you it's okay to be writing, and that's like really, really helpful. You don't have to be you don't have to be like a megalomaniac to do the work in that way. You just have to be like, this is my only job. Someone told me that this is what I'm supposed to do. But yeah, I did not expect. I was working on this in the cornfields of Iowa, where I was very far away from like actual publishing discussions. And like one of the beautiful things about going to Iowa was that it was this place where people just talked about art. And so I was really in a place where I was like judging whether or not the scenes were working, and I was like in graduate school workshops with people who were better at writing scenes than I was. So I was like, I'm doomed. Their metaphors are great. Like, so I was so in it that I couldn't have imagined what it would look like as an object in the world. And I'm really grateful for that. Now that I know things about how book publishing works, I'm like almost trying to unlearn them as I write again, because there's a huge difference between art and the market. And sometimes the two converge and often they don't. So yeah.
Yeah. I guess I'd had a conversation recently with somebody about this. There's just, I find there's like two ways to deal with doubt as a writer. There is doubt about a project, which is like, I don't know if this scene works. I don't know if this plot works, and so on. Then there's another thing, which is far more dangerous, I think, which is kind of meta doubt, which is doubt about the entire enterprise. Like, should I be a writer? Is this worth my time? And I think you're very blessed as a writer if you're not dealing with the meta doubts. But I'm just, you made an interesting answer there a moment ago when you said, part of what it sounds like helps you deal with those bigger meta doubts is like, hey, you went to Iowa, you've already been given that kind of validation. But I'm just wondering, I mean, I ask this of you because you are somebody who just finished, a publishing journey and got their debut book published, and a career is so uncertain before that. Were there any other ways that you sort of got through those moments of doubt? Like, should I be doing this at all? Or did you always just feel pretty confident?
No, I definitely did not feel confident. And I think some of my lack of confidence does have to do with like coming from an immigrant background. I didn't know people who made art in America. Like, that was an impossible thing to imagine. I remember telling my parents pretty young that I wanted to be a writer, and my dad just like nodded somberly and was like, that will be very competitive and difficult.
Here, drink this lemonade.
Yeah, I wonder where this book came from. So I never really had any sort of surety. What I had was a certainty that like I loved to read, and it was like almost the only thing that I really loved. Like, there's that awful Bukowski quote that's also really great. That's like, you should only be a writer if doing anything else would lead you to murder or suicide. And like, not to be too dark, but that is the only reason I could keep going, is because I was like, I cannot do anything else. And moments of doubt included arriving on campus in college and realizing that there were people who'd grown up in Manhattan and like not only already had read all of the books on the planet, but were like friends with the people who wrote them. Stuff like that. And then after school, I really struggled to get a job as a journalist because I think I was a pretty mediocre journalist. So I was unemployed for like 6-7 months and didn't really know how to publish short stories. Was like cat sitting for someone in a like co-op in Boulder for a couple months, like claiming to be writing a novel and really just like scrolling the internet looking for jobs that would like make me feel legitimate. Even when I was a journalist, like I had a job, but like no one was reading my articles. So yeah, I did not feel like I have one of those resumes that I think makes it seem like I had it together. And I really, really didn't. And I think that's like kind of an important thing to publicly acknowledge, and to acknowledge that like, that was really hard. It was emotionally taxing. I feel extraordinarily fortunate to have gone to graduate school eventually, but that wasn't even on my radar to apply. I was really like out in the cold for a while.
Well, and I think it's important for people who are really engaging with this book to understand that you basically went to an amazing couple of universities. You sort of had that resume, for better or for worse, and yet here you still felt at sea in life. And it's just sort of like, well, if the only point of us being here is to get into Harvard, and then you get into Yale or Harvard or what it is, and it's still a mess, well, what then?
Yeah, a lesson in emptiness or something.
Yeah. All right. So we have a couple questions from the audience. Oh, here we go. I was going to ask one more question of my own, but we're in the audience questions already. Okay. What is it like, all caps, having your book optioned for a Hulu series? #notworthy.
I have to correct something. It has not been optioned for a Hulu series. It has been optioned by Mindy Kaling's production company.
Oh. I don't know why I thought Hulu, but that's my bad.
The Hulu connection probably came from, I'm working with the president of her production company, Jessica Scott, who was an executive at Hulu. So that's probably where that came from.
Okay,
so we will soon be pitching networks, places like Hulu. But right now we're like just sort of zeroing in on who the showrunner will be. And I'm starting the work of getting into the pitch, basically. So it's been really cool. I've done some screenwriting, but not very much. So I will be co-writing with someone. I'll be very involved in the adaptation. I'll be co-writer, I'll be co-EP if we get to that stage. And one thing that I'm really excited about is just sort of developing a new kind of narrative intelligence. Like there's a way that screenwriters are taught to think that novelists are not, that is so fascinating and just all about structure and escalation, and like the opposite of the way I write fiction too. Like I vomit draft, you can't do that when you're doing a screenplay. You really have to have plans. So I think I'm gonna learn a lot. It's been exciting.
That's awesome. I had another question for you. Jenna, feel free to pop some other questions up. But one question while you're doing that is, so Iowa. I love talking when people go on the show and they have been to Iowa Writers Workshop. Before we get to that question, I will ask. Getting into Iowa Writers Workshop to some people appears like getting drafted by the Yankees, right? I mean, this is like the place, right? And so I guess I like to do a little thing called like 30-second MFA. So you went to Iowa, you suffered through it, you vomit drafted and critiqued everybody else's vomit drafts, and you came out 2 years later with this great manuscript. But for those of us who didn't go to Iowa, give us like the one or two things that are just absolutely indispensable that you learned there.
I will say that I think the value of it was less like quick lessons and more like just space and time. But okay, here are two things that come to mind. Both are about POV. So I think like I thought I never really thought about point of view beyond like, oh, you have a first person narrator who uses I, or you have a third person narrator who uses she, he, they. That's it. Narration is apparently much more complicated than that, and mystical and almost spiritual. So I learned about this idea called point of telling, which refers to where your narrator sits in relation to the events of the story. So like Holden Caulfield is in an asylum when he is telling the events of The Catcher in the Rye. Esther Greenwood, who narrates The Bell Jar, is sitting in a house watching a baby play, who's presumably her baby. We learned that in the first 2 pages of The Bell Jar. So we know that the narrator, who was going to like attempt to commit suicide several times and freak out about having children, we know she grows up to have a child. So that influences how the story is told. So a handy craft tip is like, if you're stuck, if you don't know what your character is supposed to be thinking, don't think about what they were thinking at the time. Think about where they are when they're telling the story, and how does that affect how they would tell the story. I think that's probably one of the most important lessons that I learned there.
That is terrific. I love that. I often find myself wondering that, like when I'm critiquing other people's work, I'm thinking like, where does this information even come from?
Yeah.
You know, like who is this person? What is their attitude towards the other characters? How did they arrive at, if there's like, for example, kind of a letter that's found or something, or, if it's like a thriller and there's some piece of evidence, like, how did this evidence end up on this page? Is the person narrating this a police officer sitting in an evidence room with a bunch of evidence, or what?
Yeah.
But I've never heard that phrase before. That's really interesting.
Yeah. And point of telling exists in third person narration too. Like, it's most obvious in first person narration, but like, if you think about the narrator of, say, Anna Karenina or The Age of Innocence, like, these are like Tolstoy and Edith Wharton and these famous third person writers often had an orientation toward their subject matter. They had this sort of like, I'm going to be snarky and omniscient and judgmental, and in Tolstoy's case, like, judge you against Christian ideals. And so that is an orientation. That is where the narrator sits.
Right. Excellent. Okay, time for one more question before we wrap. Let's get one more question on the screen. What is Sanjena working on now? Can she balance promoting and creation?
I don't talk about what I'm working on because I think it can break it, but I'm trying to work again. Balancing promotion and creation is really hard. I think you just have to be really intense about your time. So I am finally getting back to writing after about 3 months off. And I'm feeling like my life come back to me. But I do have to basically protect my mornings and just try to be away from everything else in the mornings, and then be able to do stuff like this in the afternoon and feel like a full enough person to do them. Otherwise, I just was thinned out. I felt very flat.
Wait, so the work you're working on in the morning, you're working on, say, a new novel or a prose project, and then is there also other time set aside to write this screenplay that's coming out?
Yeah. So primarily I'm working on new prose, but the screenplay stuff we've really just been in like meetings talking to potential showrunners so far. Last summer, when I learned that we were looking towards an option, I got myself an Airbnb and printed out thousands of pages of pilots and read those and like practiced writing pilots. So I'm not currently writing a screenplay, but I have like done some of that prep work.
Got it. And I just can't help but ask, do you feel that, you sort of answered this question already, but I want to ask in a different way. This practice, this discipline of writing in this new medium, do you feel like that helps your normal prose, your novel writing practice?
I'm trying to figure that out. I'm still learning. I think there are ideas from screenwriting like the inciting incident, like get to the thing that kicks off the story sooner. That's all really useful. But also novels get to meander. And so if we write those things, if we write novels too close to the way we write screenplays, I think we'll do some damage to the form. So in some ways, I might even have to separate the forms and be like, this is a screenwriting thing. This is a prose thing. They don't have to work for each other.
Wow, that is really interesting. I wish we'd started with that. To be continued. That is just a really interesting idea that there's some things that you might do damage to the novel by making it too much like a screenplay. Next time you talk on this show when you have your next book, we're going to dig into that. Okay, so we've got to wrap here, folks. We're going to pop the link in again for Acapella Books in Atlanta for you to get a signed copy of Gold Diggers. Kanye, I know you're watching. Please just read the book. Read it all the way through. It's amazing. It's going to change your life. And then I want to end with this question, Sanjena. I ask everybody this question who comes on the show. So imagine the ideal reader for this book, just the person who is getting this just how you wish it would be gotten, and receiving the work in just the ideal way. Describe for me, when that person finishes reading this book and closes it and it's sitting on their lap, in a word or a phrase, what is the feeling that this reader has?
Potentially possibility. Like, I think people talk a lot about recognition as though like when minorities put our stories on the page, like the only purpose that serves is to like represent. But I hope that it goes from there to possibility, like what Neil experiences. If there's only one way of being brown, that sucks. But maybe this book can help you conceive of some other way to be. That would be neat.
Awesome. I love that. I love that. Sanjena, thank you so much for being on the show. The book is terrific. This was great. Congratulations on all your success. And we'll be looking out for more news on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. This was fun.
All right.
Bye.
See you next week, everybody, on the